So, hope you all are doing well today. I'm trying something a little bit different from my usual format. I've been doing writing for a number of years, and while I enjoy that process, and I know like many of you who read my stuff kind of enjoy that, I find that after a while I get quite bored with just being me and paper and not really, or the computer screen, not really have anything to do with interacting with people. So I'm trying something like a video essay or maybe streaming or something like that to really get the feeling like I'm talking to someone and doing well. So I apologize for the quality and the look and anything. This is clearly not a normal studio here that you would do this on, but move fast and break things, right? So we're gonna give this a shot. So today, due to circumstances in my life, I started thinking about kind of a question that's come up over the last couple of years when it comes to thinking about organizations and structures. And really it's kind of a question of like why do we have bosses and kind of the standard work that we have today. I mean, this isn't like the most pressing question that I think of when it comes to the world in general, or at least organizations, but I know among me and my friends and a lot of the thought leaders in the industry, like there's kind of this question of like, well, why do we have the structure we have here? Like, like when you go into a business and you have, structures of people, you've probably heard of like lots of mediocre bosses or bosses who don't do a great job. And that you may have a great boss who does something well, but you're dealing with bosses who are basically not incredibly good at the work that they do. And particularly if you are somebody who works under that sort of circumstance or have to commonly engage with folks like that, eventually you start to ask the question of, well, why do we have this structure? I mean, the reason why a lot of this is coming up more recently, at least in my opinion, is because of the fact that agile kind of took over the world in software. And when you think of like a normal agile structure and like a well-structured agile team, what are we saying? We take a bunch of people who have some really excellent skill sets in a particular area, or common skill sets. Like if you're in software development, for example, you may have a front-end developer, back-end developer, maybe even a DBA, some other group, and then you have a bunch of people who have good talent. You put them in a group together, give them an iteration manager who is there to hold the space. They're not a boss in traditional sense, they're just there to make sure the team works. You give them a sense of problems and says, go and solve this. I mean, ultimately, when groups are operating in that way, at least in the tiny microcosm of the agile group, there really isn't a boss so much as there's a list of work and a bunch of people who are going after that. Like, often the structure that these folks have just exists outside of the agile team that says, we're going to go after this problem or A, B, or whatever. Once it gets to that group, they kind of go off and do their own thing. That's how it's supposed to work. If you just extend that out beyond that, if you extend it out beyond the purpose here, it's almost like, well, if we can make decisions on how to make the right technical decisions or find the best technical path, couldn't we do the same thing with management structure? Business structure? I mean, why do we have this strict hierarchy? Why do we have little self-contained groups that are working great, that are doing the right thing, that has proven to work in software, that has proven to done these good things, and yet when you jump into management hierarchy, it's something entirely different. It's a hierarchy that operates fully differently, which, by the way, not dissimilar to how waterfall worked, not dissimilar to how these things worked 20, 30 years in the past. We had strict hierarchy, designed roles, putting people into boxes, and then they couldn't move outside of that. And we found that it didn't work as well as this new structure. Why not move it up to the next level? That's kind of been a question there. And certainly from some groups, I know the authors of the book Rework came out with I think the book is called, The Way We're Working is Not Working. That kind of has some questions related to this, kind of talking about the way I'm not sure if they were talking about bosses specifically, but they certainly talked about that hierarchy in that, that area. And so when you look into it, that's kind of one area of, well, this may not work. Another area is that there's just a lot of negative that comes out of like the traditional hierarchical structure of the way businesses operate. We have bosses on top bosses on top bosses. We're told that businesses are supposed to be a meritocracy, and that if you do very good at your job, you are supposed to be the one who's at the top of the list. And if you lose to someone, they should be at least comparable to your skill set, if not a little bit better than you at your particular skill set. There should be something that looks like meritocracy. But honestly, you have a lot of bosses that invite politics, shenanigans, people trying to collect power under themselves. A lot of negative stuff. And honestly, I've been fortunate to not have to see a lot of this inside of my current business. But when you go to startups, this is often rampant. Startups, honestly, are the worst. I've seen organizations are the worst at this, where you have people who just start collecting power and structure and trying to help themselves. And often it comes at the sacrifice of the work. It comes at the sacrifice of the work and the sacrifice at the people who are working inside of this, who are, meritocratically the best, the people who have the best skills, the best work. And often you have that. So when you're looking at the way agile works and versus the damage here, why wouldn't you try something different? Why wouldn't you do something else? Why do we need the boss here? Why wouldn't we be capable of coming up some structure and some ideas here? And then just flat out, you see a lot of damage. Even if your boss is not overly political, if you're in that good fortune of having that, and even if you don't have these things happen, well, you still have people make bad decisions. You still have people who are in positions of power that go in there and direct the team in the wrong way, in the wrong place, and all of a sudden you run into something that looks like, well, a bad decision or a set of bad decisions that make you worse. A different boss or different circumstances, or a bad boss can take a whole organization and just absolutely crush it. And actually, there's a philosophy that eventually middle management will be filled with people who are just not very good at their job. I mean, this is the Peter principle, that you advance to the level of your competence, and that basically if you start at the low level and you're good at that, you get promoted to the next. Eventually, you get promoted to an area that you can't go past because you're just not that good at your job. I personally don't subscribe to this, but there's at least a hint of truth to how the Peter principle operates, and that you do end up getting a lot of people who are not very good. Particularly with the way agile works, where you have teams that are self-directed and understand what they need to do and tend to do better than other teams. Why wouldn't you just extend that out? Why do we need the concept of a boss in general? Why do we have these hierarchies that end up sitting there? So kind of thinking about this and think through this idea. Actually, hold on a sec. I need to learn how to do that better. So when we talk about why do we have bosses and hierarchies, a kind of a natural parallel is to kind of think of why do we have leaders in general? Or why do we have long-standing leaders in general? They have this idea that you have a meritocracy and you'll have people collect, but then you have nations, for example, where for the longest time we had kings and we had hierarchies that came out of that, and for the longest time we kind of ran that way, where we centralize power into often one individual or often one family one family, but very minority group, and they were charged with taking care of everything among the group of people. They were there. You had a strict hierarchy, and then you had strictly only a certain number of people that could fill that role. So we kind of have this idea of strict hierarchy and strict positions within that. The only people who could be kings were really people who were born into the royal family. And then even as we went down, the people who were knights were only people that came from a certain place in society. Lords, certain place in society. And if you weren't born into those groups, you could never advance to that. So it's almost strict position, strict hierarchy is the way you might think about that. But then over time, we started to loosen that relationship, that kings became less important, and then lords, started getting more and more power. And who could be a lord started to change. Who could be inside those different houses changed. It started with, you think of the United Kingdom and the, House of Lords, and then you had the House of Commons, and then and anyone could be in the House of Commons. House of Lords was a small group. And then eventually power started slowly coming until eventually the House of Commons ended up becoming the Parliament, the group of people. And so you kind of have this move where you started, the hierarchical structure within those organizations, within those nations, I should say, started to become more democratic. It started to switch to more and more people. And then who could get into those positions started to change as well. And you kind of had a fixed hierarchy for a nation, but who could move in there changed. And for businesses, you kind of have something similar to that. Not exactly. You have certain businesses that they're started by an individual, but there is a fixed hierarchy within that business, and then you have a fixed structure or a flexible structure. Not flexible structure, flexible positions within that, where you have the proverbial person who started by sweeping the floors ended up being CEO one day. And that's something that you sometimes see in nations, but is much more common in businesses. Not even that common then, but you do have this idea that you can start at a low position and do well inside of that organization. But of course, you have still a fixed hierarchy. And for the business world, like nations don't change that often. Like a group of people don't change so frequently that a flexible hierarchy inside your government is a good thing, which is why you see long-standing structures, things like the US Constitution, that doesn't change very often. And often when people are arguing about big changes within that, you see the changes at the edges, particular amendments, particular rights being added in. The core structure of this is the way these three parts of government work, and these are the rules to do that, don't change very often because who the US people are doesn't change very often. Versus a business where markets are constantly shifting, products are changing, doing things like that, fixed hierarchies don't always work so well. This is the argument of the people who say, why do we have bosses? Or why don't we move entirely to agile? Why do we even deem people necessary? Because when you look at something like, like a technology business, for example, the world we were in, the market we were in, the products that were available were so vastly different just 20 years ago that whatever hierarchy you are designing today to try to handle that, just flat out is not going to be sufficient to handle the needs of this new set of projects. Just something as simple as who your support team is, like over 30 years ago, for example, if you had a support team, it would be people who are sitting in call centers, picking up the phone and calling people. But now that has switched quite a bit. It went from phones to emails to like things like message boards, even things like that, to now today you can get feedback from anywhere. You can get it from Twitter, you can get it from social media. Rarely anyone is going to be calling you. And you have different, you don't even have that. You may get emails or message, but it's all happening digital. You think of just that change and what is the best structure to be able to handle that? Who are the best people and what skills do they need to be able to manage that are very different. Running a call center where people need to be together on phones and chatting is vastly different than somebody who's going to be scanning social media, particularly with the technology. If you had a fixed hierarchy for those organizations that entire time, the organization that's going to go well here is not going to do anything for this new group. And Agile largely helps resolve some of those issues. Maybe not all of them, but it says that if the structure changes, as long as we're still dealing with software, as long as we're still dealing with the same kind of core group and people, we can keep changing and change the hierarchy over time to be able to have that. So why do we have to have this fixed structure on top of Agile? Instead, why can't the whole thing change and morph a little bit? Well, I guess I'll get into why I think this might be different, or why the arguments for bosses, I guess, or this sort of structure. So leadership is kind of a naturally emerging property within a group. When you go inside of any sort of group of people, particularly agile groups, like you will have diversity of talent. And you will have certain people who are better at certain things than others. I mean, just starting from kind of the core place, like me on my team, for example, I tend to be quite good at project management sort of work. I tend to be good at scripting and things like that. And decent at metrics. I'm terrible at standard administrative work. Networking, I'm just, I like somehow that's a skill that I've never been able to pick up despite how many times I went into it. But at administrative work, I'm okay. Networking, I'm awful. But then I have coworkers who are like geniuses at this sort of thing and just seem to understand it very well. So for me, it's kind of a very natural divide where I say, hey, I'm going to pick up the project management work, the communication and things like that. If you do the networking, why don't we work together and do that? And that's something that our team does well with. It seems to work for us today. But then you split this out to any group. That's going to happen in all teams, in all sorts of structures, to where you start dividing up the work and certain people are going to get different sort of responsibilities. But this doesn't happen evenly. In a totally fair system, you are very likely to see, actually it's almost the rule, that you're going to see responsibility center into certain individuals. That all people kind of split up work and move into it. But there are certain people on teams, maybe one, maybe many, where a majority of the responsibility tends to go. and work, because their skills for whatever they're doing tend to be either more important or they just happen to be that much better that you're constantly going to that group. So even when you're kind of in these agile groups, even when you have a true meritocracy, and there's no barrier, there's no real physical barriers to speak of that are stopping people from swapping roles and doing work, you tend to get people that look like leaders. You might call them natural leaders. Because as work moves around these groups and work gets centralized into different parts, all of a sudden you take a look at it and responsibility goes to particular people. Not that the other people don't matter, they do. But as you get more, all of a sudden it becomes clear that everyone tends to be going to certain people more often. And when you know everything that goes on, if you're in your normal day-to-day, that's totally, fine. They have more work going to them. Why does that matter? It's because on your day-to-day, you're not dealing with total certainty. You're not dealing with total information. Sometimes you're dealing with some very scary situations. Maybe you're dealing with situations that you don't know. Something critical breaks down. Something big happens in the world that you have to deal with. Maybe like a global pandemic that no one's dealt with before. Or an entire shift inside your organization where something hits you from the side. During those times where everyone is uncertain and you have to make decisions, well, who are you going to go to make those decisions? Well, it's very likely the people you've given a majority of your responsibility to. Just simply because nobody has good answers, but the people who are doing the majority of the work, or majority of the right sort of work, might be another way to think about it. Maybe you have somebody on your team's really, really good at administrative, but if you're dealing with an organizational issue, maybe you'll find the person who's dealt well with organizations to go and handle that. And it just so happens that if you have people that have a majority of the responsibility on your team, chances are that key thing that they need to navigate you through is going to fall within their wheelhouse. So what ends up happening? You give them the keys to the vehicle. You give them the keys to ride and say, here, please take us through because I and we don't know what to do, but you, on the other hand, do. So now what happens? Well, you want safety, you want them to drive you through. You've given up responsibility, you've given up power. You've given them power to go and drive you and get you someplace good. And if this is a meritocracy, you're quite happy to do that. You go off and say, please take us through this dangerous situation we're in where I'm not really sure what to do. Navigate us through and do. And you get out and what happens? They've even gotten more moral authority if you've survived. If they fail miserably, well, that's an entirely different matter. But if they survived, you've given them more authority, you've given them more trust, they've shown themselves capable, so what are you going to do? Well, you're probably going to give them even more responsibility. Ultimately, I guess the point I'm getting at is even among well-structured organizations, even among groups that you don't want to have centralization, you don't want to centralize power, you're naturally going to see centralization happen. That's just how people work. And that's just not a feature of internal team dynamics, because that's all I've been talking about. Where strict hierarchy gets really implemented inside of organizations is when you need to communicate with other teams. And what I just described to you is something where you can raise a leader, but then if you don't like that leader, if they're not getting what you need, or they leave and they do that, you can replace that and say, well, the locus of control was maybe more on the technical side, but now we're in an operational area, so now we're trusting this other person. Now we're trusting this other group. But really where it starts to get set and why businesses today prefer strict hierarchy is when you deal with other organizations. Like you're a development team and all of a sudden you need to talk to your data team, the database team. What are you going to do when you have to talk to them? Well, let's say you're a 12-person team and you're dealing with another 12-person team. And let's just say, for instance, that bosses don't exist in this particular case. Let's say we're in the teal organization sort of structure, and I want to go and talk to that organization and figure out who I need to talk to. Well, under a true meritocracy, on what you have, where my team decides who they want to speak to, well, you're basically holding interviews with that other team to figure out who you need to talk to. Maybe you have something that looks like an iteration manager, and that may guide you to who you need to talk to. And again, relying on their internal structure to know who's the right person. All of a sudden, then, you're trying to figure out who to speak to. And often, again, that's another responsibility. So we need to make contact with another team, or another team wants to make contact with us. What do? Well, we think through who have we given responsibility to, who has the answers we need to go to, and who's right to fit that, and who's it going to be? Well, likely to the people we already gave a bunch of our responsibilities to, who are already naturally doing that, who we like and trust to do that. So we're probably just going to tell them to go to the same 1, 2, or 3 people you always have. So what ends up happening? Group A needs to make contact with Group B, and Group B kind of takes the people who've already had that communication, and now they're communicating together. The leader of Group B, or whoever you deem, is now talking to the leader of Group A, and work is getting done. Instead of having to figure out between 12 people trying to get out a message, try to figure out communication, instead I'm just dealing with 1 or 2 individuals talking to 1 or 2 individuals. Now you take out a dozen organizations like this, or a dozen agile groups that you do 1, 2, 3, 4 down the line. And you have a dozen people that are sitting there. Let's say I'm a person who's responsible for the organization. Again, no hierarchy here. I'm just saying I'm the person who started this company. I'm the CEO. I'm managing this organization. I'm at the very top, and I got something big I need to deal with here. I mean, there's a big problem that we're dealing with, and I need my teams organized. I need people making the right decisions here. What do? Well, I go and talk to my different teams. Maybe I don't have a specific person in mind, but I know I need my software teams working on this big initiative, and that needs to happen now. What are we going to do about this? Well, I go to those teams and talk to, well, the leaders within those teams. The people who have been stuck within those, people who already operate at a high level, which again, will be the people where responsibility is centralized already. So not only am I talking to the people that, that have most of the responsibility, but now I can disseminate information to the rest of the group. So what have I done? Within these organizations, I've already created something that looks like a traditional hierarchy, a traditional structure. And now I'm talking with leader A, B, C, D. And again, we go through a problem. We have a big issue. No one knows how to deal with it. Even the leader is probably a little worrisome that something bad is going to happen. But then you get through it. Something good happens. Or it's not as bad as you expected, or you had to go through something trying. What ends up happening? Well, all of a sudden, if we have to do that again, or we go through the issue, or it's a slightly different problem, but I still know I have to deal with software database, who would I go to? Well, I probably go to the same leaders who have always been there. I go to the leaders that I can deal with. And you create something that looks like kind of a naturally arising hierarchy. So what do businesses do in these organizations? Well, they like these hierarchies. They like these structures, or they like that stability of knowing who I can go to. And they want to make it easier for themselves to be able to do that in the future. So for example, maybe I have, let's keep it simple. Let's say we have my dozen teams or whatever, and all of a sudden in team A, the leader I had left. That happens. Or they're moving on to a different opportunity or whatever, and that person drops out. Well, who do I talk to? Who ends up making decisions? Well, you can naturally let the team formulate and figure out, well, now that we don't have this person, again, no standard hierarchy, and I need to hire someone to go and do that. Maybe it's a secondary leader, but maybe they don't have the right skills to be that sort of leader. Maybe they're a great technical leader, but not a great managerial leader. Or they're great at finance and they don't have, or they're a great tester, but they don't have quite the skills. Well, the business is just going to flat out say, well, okay, I need a leader to join that group. I need somebody to come in and say, to do this. So what do? Well, I have a role. It's called the boss. And I have a nameplate and everything that goes along with it. And when that role is absent, I say, I'm going to naturally promote somebody into that position so that even if they don't completely fill it, I have my organization already set. I don't have to wait for the group to self-organize to figure out where it is. I have that ease to be able to go and do that. All of a sudden, what have I just done? Well, I created a strict hierarchy. I've created power in that role. All of a sudden, I've assigned power to the role, because before it could have arisen naturally. This team has a leader who's just naturally very good at that sort of thing, and they got all these roles and responsibilities, and they just naturally rose to it. And there was no difference between what the role needed and what that person was good at. They were one and the same thing inside of this natural organization. But then we're promoting somebody who doesn't have those skills, who doesn't necessarily have the same mixture of skills that they need to. They need to grow into the role. Sometimes you hope they grow into it, but sometimes they don't. So they have all the same power that role have. Because again, responsibility is power. It's one in the same thing. If I give you responsibility, you are going to have power to make decisions. I've given you the responsibility, and you may fail at that, but all of a sudden I've locked in the power. If your team absolutely hates you, or you rise into that role and you don't do it, all of a sudden I don't really have the ability to depose you. My employees really don't have that power. It arose because the big manager, big boss, said, I wanted this hierarchy. I want this ease of communication, which is a good thing, which is a valuable thing for the organization. It's not like this is without merit, but still, I created this role, I did this, and I promoted someone who I'm hoping, rolls into it, and they've gotten all the power. That doesn't change, but they may not be able to do the responsibility as good. And so all of a sudden you start to get mediocre inside of this role. You start to get people who are not so well fitted. And then it's also fixed, because at the time that I make these roles and changes, the world is one way, the world is one direction, that sort of way. And we're trying to match that as closely as possible. So I put in a strict hierarchy for ease of communication and sometimes necessary communication. But as soon as the world starts to change, all of a sudden this is outdated. Still might be able to do it. You still might be able to manage it, but you're not going to be able to do it to the same level. You're not going to be able to do it to the same, it's not going to be able to match as well. And if the world switches too much, then you got to do a reorganization. And when you do a reorganization, all of a sudden, now you're just kind of guessing. You're not naturally arising. This is where you start. Like, if it naturally arose from, say, self-organized teams, promoting leaders that then get into those positions, that's a good thing. But that takes time. And businesses are impatient. They want to get that good communication. They want to get that good people, those good roles. They want people to grow into roles. But often it's people thinking, well, what would be the best organization for this? And they don't really take that into consideration. It's why you get a lot of these issues. So ultimately, I think that's where you get to these strict hierarchies. And it's kind of matched to what would happen naturally. It's just what happened naturally relies on you having good people, good actors, a well-placed structure to be able to make sure that agile teams don't dissolve, which is very tricky, but you get something that already looks like hierarchy. You already get something that looks like this. Even in a fully self-managed organization, you will have leaders. Just the difference is those will almost always be something you call natural leaders, or leaders who arise from the group because they start centralizing responsibilities. Their teammates trust them. When other teams communicate with them, they are the ones who stand up and go and do that. And it's closer to meritocracy. So really, the problem with today isn't the fact that we have bosses. It's we don't know how to get around strict hierarchy yet. That's really the key. When we say we have bosses, it's not really the idea that we don't like leaders. We love leaders. I mean, you think about the way organizations work and operate. We don't care necessarily for bosses, especially those who are working into the role or maybe just bad actors into those positions, but we love the natural leaders we pick. When the shit hits the fan and you need to get somebody out there to do that, the person you turn to and say, please help us, is your leader. I mean, if you think about my favorite times inside of organizations are actually the chaos or the chaotic situations where something big hits right away. And you have the hierarchy and the way you deal with things or whatever, but things go there. And it's almost like you take the hierarchy, wipe it to the side, and you say, I don't care what team members, I don't care what structure it is, I don't care all hands, I don't care what communication channels we decided we were going to use or what Slack channel we were going to connect or whatever. I don't care. I need the best people suited for this job to do that. And I need to talk to the best teams. When you're in that sort of environment, the people you turn to say, please get us out of this situation, please do that, are your leaders. And if that happens to be your boss, if it happens to be the person there, or it's the people that are already kind of leading it, you're in a very good place. Your organization matches the natural leadership that your team has already decided. It's when you turn to somebody who's other than your boss to go and say, please bring us out of this, that we start to get skewed and we start to have issues. Much like we started with kings and we moved on from kings to something that looked more like, more representation by the people, to then true representation by the people, where you can, get representatives, get your own people into the role, and whatever comes next, whatever that evolves into, more democratic, more rule by the people, likely in that situation. We see the same thing with businesses, but the truth is that unlike a nation where a strict hierarchy makes sense because nations don't change that quickly, businesses do. And that strict hierarchy is really a communication stopgap. It's easier for bosses to work through that, and it's just easier for people to just assume a certain person has a position rather than to make it work flexibly. There are certain organizations that are working around strict hierarchy. Organizations like Valve, the gaming company, is one. I know Gore-Tex, which is the clothing manufacturer, has these things where they have something that you might call a self-managed organization. It's almost like an agile team that has grown to take over all pieces of the organization. And within those organizations, you have something closer to meritocracy. I'm not sure if it's exact. It won't be perfect. But you have hierarchies that match the market. They are not strict hierarchies like you have in a traditional business where I can sit there and write out the chart at any one point and say this is the business chart that exists. It matches more fluidly to the position I talked to before that says you find a way to find the best leaders. They rise to the position. Then those leaders choose who they do. It looks something like a hierarchy. The difference is that the hierarchy does not stay strictly in that position. If the markets change, the hierarchy will change along with it. These are experimental. We have some ideas that they might work, and we have good testing from agile philosophy in traditional organizations that this might be able to extend up, but it's trickier. I mean, the reason why we had kings for so long is because democracy is hard. You can't have 9 out of 10 pieces of it working and have a fully functioning thing. All the metaphorical 10 things have to be working within a democracy to make it operate correctly. Anything less than that, and you don't have functioning democracy. Actually, you have something that's far worse than that. Kings worked. They built nations. There was a scale to them that you couldn't scale them beyond a certain part. And there's certainly some horrible things that kings have done in our world, but they were better than their alternative, which was something that looked like more like anarchy, or ruled by basically gang warfare or tribal warfare, or something else. Once we unlocked the pieces to get the next level, and we got all 5, 10, 12, however many pieces working together, we're able to move on. Businesses are in the same way. Strict hierarchy works. Having a boss today is the inefficient but works. Flexible hierarchy will be, I believe, the next era. And I believe Agile is already planting the seeds of that in a lot of traditional organizations, but we don't have all the pieces. Maybe we have 8 out of 10. But we haven't figured out those last pieces to make it truly scale. Some organizations are going out. But at least for now, the boss works. And at least in some organizations, you'll have that sort of leadership structure. You'll have the best person for the job be in that role. Just because it's inefficient doesn't mean it doesn't work. But hopefully we can get to the point where we can get to that thing that looks like true meritocracy. And hopefully get something that looks a little bit better. But anywho, hope you enjoyed this. This went about 33 minutes, which I was expecting. Let me know what you think about this, or what you think about the structure. I know for me, I've done a little bit more, I guess hopefully not rambling, hopefully have a thought. But I'm trying to do a new structure here to see if this actually works. So anyway, thank you very much for listening.